Today, I'm going to talk about data services in WSO2 Micro Integrator, especially for relational database management systems. Data services feature within WSO2 Micro Integrator facilitates exposing data of variety of data sources as data services. Simply, what that means is exposing data within data sources in a service format such as SOAP or REST. WSO2 Micro Integrator supports variety of data sources, including relational database management systems, CSV files, spreadsheets, MongoDB like NoSQL databases, and so forth. And that's not it. WSO2 Micro Integrator can be used to create custom data sources as well. And if you have another type of data source, and if that's not supported, there are means within WSO2 Micro Integrator to create custom data sources. And of course, in that case, you'll have to implement some custom logic. But when it comes to more popular data sources like relational database management systems and CSV, it's pretty straightforward. So in case of a relational database management system, what it takes to create a data service within WSO2 Micro Integrator has several steps actually. So you have to specify your data source parameters and where it is located, the credentials needed to connect to the database and so forth. And you will also need to specify how the input parameters are mapped to query parameters. And that's because in relational database management systems, you fetch details using SQL statements, right? So you execute SQL statements, and those SQL statements may have input parameters that you need to supply from an external source, such as using a REST query parameter or something similar, right? Or maybe you extract it using a payload within a SOAP format and so forth. And of course, once the query returns the response, and that will be an SQL response, and we need to indicate how those query responses are represented as service responses and so forth. So we're going to talk about a fictitious example here. And so I'm going to use the MySQL database to demonstrate this, and we will have the micro integrator. Specifically, I will use the micro integrator embedded within the integration studio, which is the integrated development environment IDE for developing integration scenarios for micro integrator. So we will go through and create a database within the MySQL database, and we'll have a table named account holder, and under that you will have a few columns including account ID, first name, last name, and contact number, and so forth. And we'll have a few sample rows within that database. And then we will use micro integrator to create integration studio to create the data service logic, and we will deploy that data service logic to fetch these details given a REST API is sending, let's say, the account ID. And when the REST API sends the account ID 123 in a query parameter or something similar, we will extract that value within the micro integrator data service logic, and we'll pass that to the SQL statements and fetch these details. A very simple scenario. So that's should show you the steps that's needed to create a data service within micro integrator, specifically within the integration studio. So let's go to WSO2.com. So you can also refer to WSO2 documentation with related to how to create data services. There are some good tutorials and examples there. But I believe this video should be a very good supplementary for you to follow through how to create a data service. So, so recently WSO2 released the API Manager 4 version, which also kind of uh, a one platform for API management, integration, and event-driven architecture. So that also means the WSO2 Micro Integrator is now falls under WSO2 API Manager version 4. So if you just go to try it now. For you to download the API manager, you can download here. But you also see, yeah, so let's click on the try it now. You also see on the other components, the micro integrator, micro gateway, and streaming integrator components. So micro integrator is what we need to download and use to create data services. You can download the runtime environment, and also you will definitely need the integration studio for you to create these data services and other integration logic. So for this particular demo, I'm going to only use the integration studio, and we can run the sample or the example that we're going to create within the integration studio itself, because within the integration studio there is a embedded micro integrator runtime for testing purposes. Of course, you can also download the micro integrator separately, and then you can deploy the artifact that we develop within the integration studio to that runtime and then test as well. But to keep it simple, I'll be using the integration studio. I have already got this thing downloaded for the Windows environment. I'm currently running this in the Windows environment, and it's just a portable zip archive is what you need to download in Windows. So once you download that, you have to extract it, and then basically it's a very simple scenario. So I have got this thing extracted here. So I have double clicked this thing and opened it up here. There are plenty of examples for you to learn about different integration scenarios, but in this case, I'm gonna uh, create a data service config project. So this is what you can see here. So let's use a data service config and say uh, account holders data service. You can give whatever name that you like, and it will create a project within your workspace wherever you chose that workspace to be. It creates there. You can specify the group ID, the version, and so forth, the whatever that you like. So I'll just try to change this to something that is meaningful. Account dot holders dot data service and so forth. So it doesn't have to be anything specific like this, but it's always a good idea to give some meaningful group IDs for you to later refer. So once you create this thing, it should create a data services project here. And you see, you should be able to, okay, so create your data service over here. So before we do this thing, we also need to have the MySQL database ready, right? So that's exactly what I'm going to do next. So let's first create the MySQL database and the table with the specified columns for us to create a data service and demonstrate within the micro integrator. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use the MySQL database, but the steps are similar in terms of creating the data service within um, micro integrator is same for any other database, including Oracle, PostgreSQL, IBM DB2, and so forth. So I'm going to use MySQL because it's easy to configure, download, and configure. So I have already downloaded the Windows version of MySQL. I recommend you to follow the MySQL.com documentation for to learn how to download the MySQL version for Windows and configure for the Windows environment. Or if you're running it in any other environment, there are documentation details related to those specific environments as well. So I have already downloaded the portable version of it. I mean, just the archive. And I have configured and gone through the documentation and configured it. And what I'm going to do is now start the MySQL server. So let me go cd into this location. And if you look into this, you see a bunch of executables and other files and libraries that's needed to function a MySQL server. So to start the server, I just have to use this MySQL D executable, which is the daemon for the MySQL server. And I'm gonna just bring that up within the console. And because I have done my initial configurations and everything, it now has started on port 3306, the community server. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another command prompt and then cd into the same location and connect to my MySQL server using the MySQL client using the root user for which I have configured a password. Typically, when you want to give access to someone who wants access to a database and a table within MySQL, you don't really want to give the root access for them, but for demonstration purpose, I'm just using root. But typically, you will need to create a specific user for that particular scenario and provide only the limited access for the required databases and tables for the MySQL. But for this demonstration purpose, because I want to keep it simple, I'm going to use the root access. As you can see, I could successfully connect to the MySQL server. I can see the available databases within MySQL with show databases command. As you can see, it's a fresh install. I don't have any database created by myself, so I'm going to create a database for my demonstration purposes. You can use the create database command, and I'm going to use my data service, my underscore data service for as my database name. And now if you just issue show databases, you should see that. And now I'm gonna get into that database so that I can create the necessary tables within that data, that database and so forth, right? So my data service. Okay, so I'm within that. You can also see show tables to see if there are any tables. Of course, it should be empty because I just created it. And I can create my table. And as you can remember, I said I'm going to create a table named account holder, and which will have 4 columns: account ID, first name, last name, and contact number. And except the first column, all other columns are just varchar columns, like just text strings, right? And the account ID is an integer, so let's use that way. So create table, you have to use account holder, and then you have to use an open parenthesis, and then you have to give your account name, account ID, which is an int, and then you go and give the first name, which is varchar. I'm going to use 20 character varchar for that, and last name is again another varchar with 20 characters. Right, and then I have contact number, which is again another varchar with 20 characters. You can have other types, other data types within your table as well. WSO2 supports all common data types of MySQL and other databases as well. So make sure that you close this. Okay, so the account table should now have been created. So let me use show tables command, and there you go. We have one table created. Now we need to have some dummy data, just like I have indicated here. So 1, 2, 3 with account ID, person name Mark Hamilton, and a particular contact number. And I have another person with account ID 456 with name Joseph Fraser with contact number, another contact number, and so forth. So those are few just dummy data for us to demonstrate our data services query capabilities. Let me insert some data to that. So you have to use insert command, insert into account folder, right? And you have to give the column names. So let me use account ID first name. So I'm just trying to become a little verbose here so that you understand what exactly is happening. Last name, contact number with values. You can give contact 1, 2, 3, and the person is Mark Hamilton, and give another, um, you know, just a dummy uh, contact number. So whatever that contact number is, that should be okay. And then close your query, and one row affected. So yeah, so let's also put another value here. Fraser, and my database doesn't have any primary key or anything specific to safeguard, you know, duplicate IDs and so forth. But in a typical database, you will have all those things. So I assume those kind of values are all taken into account. But because this is just a sample, that should be okay. So okay, so we have those values. So now, if you want to issue uh, select all commands, select uh, maybe we can be a little specific here as well. Account ID, uh, first name, last name, and contact number from account folder. And as you can see, you get two rows. Now we have our database ready. Now it's we should only worry about creating our data service now. So let's get back to business. Okay, so now let's start creating our data service. So we initially created the data service config projects, and that config project should have a structure like this. It should have a folder name data service along with the POM file. And to create a data service, you just have to right click and right click the data services folder and go to new data service. You can create a new data service from here. Data service name, I can say account holders, and you can fill out the other details as you want, but I'm just going to leave it as it is for now. So this should bring us to a page or a window where we can do configuration related to how what those queries and different data sources that we need to configure for our data source within the micro integrator. So now we haven't specified anything about our database where we need to connect to and so forth. So that's exactly what I'm going to do it here. You can provide some details here. Fetching account details. These are some nice to haves, but you don't need to have those details here. Transport settings, I'll leave others as blank, but as you can see, you can fill those details. On transport settings, I can say I'm going to expose my data services HTTP and HTTPS as well. And if you want to provide any authentication authorization details, you can also configure those here. But I'll leave those things as blank because I'm just going to show you the simplest form of creating a data service within Micro Integrator. So the one important configuration is this. As you can see, data sources, that's where you say I want to connect to a relational database management system or any other data source, right? So data sources are created and listed in this section. We support an array of different DB management systems, as clearly mentioned here. So let's click that, and no data services available, so you can click a new one here. So data source type, data source identifier, I can say uh, account holders DB, and relational database management system. And as I said, there are different other types of data sources supported. You can also create some custom data sources here as well, and there are means to do that thing. I will let you follow our documentation to if you want to create some custom data sources for different data sources that you have, right? So you can use the default or external data source. I'm going to use the default one here. And the database engine is, as you can see, different types of database engines are supported: MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, IBM DB2, Postgres, uh, H2, and so forth. So I'm going to choose MySQL in this case, and note that the driver class was automatically filled up here, and the URL for my data source will be so let me use this. In fact, yeah, so data source name could be something that you like. Let's say um, account holders data source, and the URL format is already given here, the machine name or the IP address. Because I'm running it in my local machine, I can say localhost. And when I started the server, you saw that it was up and running on 3306, and my database name is account holder, account underscore holder, right? So I can leave it as that, and my username is root, and my password is whatever the password that I configured. And there are other stuff, like you can also click connection here to test if the database connection was successful. It says it's not. Let's see why. Is it account holders localhost 3306? Okay, and yeah, that should be a bug, but let's leave it as that for now. I think it should just work. Account holder uh, account underscore holder. No, that's not the database, right? My database is mi underscore data service. So that's my bad, it's a bug. So mi underscore data service. Yeah, so now it's successfully connected, as you can see. And yeah, so the data source is now created. Now we need to configure the queries. So we know that the query that I'm interested is this. So I need to provide query with a where clause with account ID. I know in my case, let's say if I want to take the account ID 123, I'm going to use this, and so forth. So this is the query that I need to work on. So let's see how to create a or how to configure a query as here in this case. And let's go here, and no available queries, click add new. Query ID, I can give whatever the name that I want. Query account details, I'm gonna say query account detail. And you can select your data source here. So because I have already created a data source previously, it shows that. and I can now put my um, query details here for you to select this. So I just want to use this one over here. So let me copy this account ID equals up to here. I'm gonna edit copy. So, but I don't want to hard code this, right? So we need to parameterize that and pass it. The way that you parameterize in within the micro integrator is you provide a colon mark and then you provide whatever that parameter name that you expect within the request. So I'll name it as account ID, just the same name as my column, right? So then I need to provide the input mapping. I need to provide an input mapping. So we don't have any input mappings, right? So I'm going to create a new one and say my mapping name is account ID. It doesn't have to be account ID, but so just keeping same would make sure that we understand what we are doing here. It's going to be a scalar. So I'm going to leave it as that, and SQL type is an int or rather string here. In fact, it needs to be an integer. So, and we can also give a default value of 456 just to make sure that we have something in here. And yeah, so that's all. So I'll put it as that, and we should have some output mappings, like specify how you want your output to be, right? Output to look like within your response. So it can be either XML, JSON, or in another format called RDF. So I'll leave it as XML. So group by element. So it will say like within an XML, let's say you will have two columns or two sub elements, and what those sub elements should be. If it matched multiple rows, you can group by an element. So this is the parent element. So I can say account detail, something like that, and row name is simply the account. I'm going to say it as account because each individual row is going to be represented as account element within the XML. That's what it says. You can specify a namespace, but I'm not going to do that. XSLT path, it doesn't make sense in this case. So let's go and match our mappings for the element. It's going to be an element, or you can specify your matched value can be part of an attribute or a complex element within XML. So, but the simplest form is element, and your data source type is a column. Output field name is you can just specify as the same names here. Account ID, we have a column name account ID. I'm going to specify the data source column name account ID and the output field name as that as well. So that to make it look okay. And schema type, because it's an XML, I'll, even though this is an integer, I'll leave it as string here. And there are other formats as well, but these are the bare minimum that you need to configure. So as you can see, you have one value already brought in, and we will have first name, copy this, and the last name, and of course the contact number as well. Okay, so now we have our uh, query details saved, so you can save it. And as you can see, the query details are saved. You can just go back and see if everything is in order. Perfect. And now we need to specify some operations. Operations expose data sources as SOAP services. Use this section to create and configure operations. This is needed if you want your service to be exposed as SOAP services. Typically, you normally need to do this thing, and there is no harm. Even though you want a REST service, we can specify a SOAP service as well here. So config operation. So the operation name is let me put that as query account uh, operation or query account detail, whatever that name can be. And the query ID is query account detail again. And as you can see, the query parameters are automatically fetched based on the details that I have placed in there. So go to that, and that's it. And if you want a REST service, of course we do, because we're going to have a REST service here, and you need to provide expose data sources as REST. Here you can have both SOAP and REST services exposed. So resource path is whatever that resource path that you like it to be. So I'm going to say account detail, and you can provide a description as the way that you want. You can specify the method in which you want to call this particular service to fetch your details. I'm going to use get, and my query ID is account details, and so this is going to be passed in as a this is going to link this particular resource, this particular get resource, to the query that we initially configured, right? So we need to have that detail in place, and we also need to have query parameters, because we need to say that query parameters is already fetched in, because so that's available in our query account details. So it's already fetched in, so you can save it. And yeah, so typically we are almost done with the REST service. So I need to save this. As you can see from this small asterisk here, it's not saved. Save it. And then if you go to the source view, you should see some XML that represents the data service. If you're familiar with the XML format of writing the data service, you're free to do that thing. But this design view makes it that much easy for us to configure a data service within the integration studio. So we are done with that. Now we need to export this as a export a project. So I'm going to create a composite application project, and say account holders exporter, and I'm going to click this so that the account data service is selected, and click here. You can again give it a proper name as you want to. Holders data service exporter, something like that, and then you can click done. So now this particular thing now should have, this pump file should have the details about what artifacts that it bundles and so forth. So let's see, get this thing deployed, and we're ready now. Okay, so let's get our exporter project put into the micro integrator runtime. So you can do that by right clicking the exporter project and running exporter project artifacts and run. You can select all the artifacts here, click on the configure button, and the reason I want to show that is to show that I have the MySQL connected. If you don't have that thing, you have to download that from the Oracle website and upload it here. And if you're connecting to any other database, you have to download the respective JDBC connector for that database and upload it here as well. And once that is done, you can save it, and then click finish. And this should bring the micro integrator up and running. And I also do have the Postman and the SOAP UI for testing purposes. We can do a quick testing and wind up for today. And so this should bring the console up and show that the exporter has successfully deployed the artifact, and should also bring out some runtime details related to here. So as you can see, the data services is have any APIs or proxy services. So you can open up the monitoring dashboard, which is a cool thing that's integrated in the latest version of the Integration Studio. You can start the monitoring dashboard within the Integration Studio itself. Once the server is up and running, it should start the Integration Studio portal in a browser. You can connect and sign in using the default admin username and password. And once you step into that, you can go to the data services section. As you can see some details there, just click on the ID here. You will see a Swagger URL, which is the uh, URL that we need to use for the REST service invocation. But one thing to note here is, in fact, as you can remember, in our data services, uh, my URL for the query URL for the in fact the REST resources, the configured REST resources, as you can see, my resource path is account underscore details, which we should specify here. So this is the base path. Yeah, I have got this thing previously tested. So account underscore detail, and then we have pass in our query parameter, and if I invoke it, I should get the response for. As you can remember, I want to put this into the account detail uh, tag, and then each row I wanted to be part of the account element. And if I just change this to 456 or something that we had previously, I should get the respective uh, response back as well. So let's quickly test the SOAP thing as well, because we had a SOAP operation included in our data service as well. So here you can see the visitor for the SOAP service. You can click on that and then go on to this and import that and use that to extract it. So you can use either SOAP 1.1 binding or SOAP 1.2 binding. So I'm going to use this one to show you. So it already picked up what input that we need to provide. So in our case, it's account ID, because that's the parameter that we need to provide. So I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, and this should bring back a SOAP response for us. And as expectedly so, it brought back, and you can just quickly test on the other one as well. So as you can see, it's a very simple way of you have a very simple way of creating data services within Micro Integrator and within the Integration Studio. So we just showed you some querying details, but in fact, in the uh, uh, in the query details, you can also add other types of queries, like not just select queries. You can do inserts, updates, and deletes as well. And that way, data services functionality is very powerful. And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll meet you in another video very soon. And please subscribe to my channel down here, so that you can be notified any new videos that I intend to record in future. Meet you soon. Thank you.